Have you ever just stopped and wondered where our modern concepts of human rights, or hospitals, or even the scientific method actually came from? Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating historical review written by Dr. Andre von Mol and published by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. It tackles a massive historical and cultural topic. Now, our goal here isn't to take sides, but to neutrally map out the author's arguments and trace his timeline of Christianity's historical impact. We're going to look strictly at the sources and the evidence he brings to the table to construct his case. So buckle up because we are covering centuries of human history in just a few minutes.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the central, highly provocative question of the entire article. What good has Christianity ever done for the world? Dr. Van Mol's core premise is that the foundational tenets of Christian biblical faith didn't just, stay quietly inside the walls of a church. Instead, they ignited a massive cultural revolution. The author argues that this revolution completely overhauled how human beings treat one another and fundamentally changed the entire trajectory of global history for the better. So, to unpack a claim that big, we're going to follow the article's four main pillars. First, the broader cultural revolution. Second, human rights and dignity. Third, medicine and social care. And finally, the roots of modern science.
Section 1, a cultural revolution and its intellectual legacy.
The author kicks off his analysis by addressing a super common modern assumption, the idea that the early Christian church was fundamentally anti-intellectual. To counter this, he cites University of Wisconsin professor David Lindberg, who points out that early church fathers actually highly valued their classical educations. We're talking about leaders who were heavily trained in Greek, Latin, philosophy, rhetoric, history, the whole shebang. The Apostle Paul is even cited as the model for the next generation, highly educated and definitely not an anti-intellectual cave dweller. The author argues that instead of destroying classical knowledge, Christianity actually became its major patron and preserver in the Latin West. And this is where the article's broader point really hits home. These beliefs had tangible, world-shaping consequences that literally still impact you and me today. Dr. Van Mol points out that Benedictine monks preserved European culture through the Dark Ages. Then, if we jump forward to 1215, we get the Magna Carta. The text cites Don Sweeten to argue that core concepts like rule by law and rule under God are deeply rooted in biblical theology. Furthermore, the article notes that major social reformers, everyone from William Wilberforce fighting slavery to women suffragists to Dietrich Bonhoeffer to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., they all explicitly utilized pointedly biblical reasoning to drive their civil rights efforts. Moving right along to Section 2, Human Rights and Dignity, a true paradigm shift. The text asserts that our modern everyday concept of human rights, it actually wasn't the historical default. It was a massive historical paradigm shift brought about by Judeo-Christian thought. Because in the pagan world of ancient Greece and Rome, extreme callousness was just the norm. Children were often considered non-persons, and the abandonment or exploitation of unwanted babies was shockingly widespread. But early Christianity stepped in and loudly condemned these practices. The author argues this response was born from a totally revolutionary idea, the radical equality and infinite value of every single human being as a beloved child of God. To back this up, Dr. Van Mol doesn't just quote theologians, he turns to secular heavyweights. Take Jürgen Habermas, for instance, widely considered Europe's preeminent philosopher. He explicitly states that egalitarian universalism, human rights, and democracy are the direct heirs of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love, so even those completely outside the faith corroborate this claim. It's a really powerful reminder that the intrinsic value we place on human life today has very, very specific historical roots. Let's move to Section 3, Medicine and Social Care, Filling a Void. According to the article, structured medical care, hospitals, and orphanages weren't just nice secular ideas that popped out of nowhere. They were direct Christian applications of biblical teaching designed to fill a massive societal void. The author draws a really sharp historical contrast here. When plagues hit the Roman Empire, the pagan attitude toward the sick and dying was often just prompt rejection and contempt. But early Christians responded entirely differently. They brought care and compassion, initially treating the sick right in their own homes because persecution kept them from building formal facilities. They stepped up to fill what the author calls the pagan void. Once Christianity was legalized, this home-based care scaled up fast. And this brings us to a fascinating, kind of hidden piece of history, and a really great word, xenodocha. Derived from the Greek words for stranger and to receive, these were essentially early hospices. They were intentionally built by Christians to deliver care for the sick, offer shelter for the poor, and provide a place of rest for weary pilgrims. This evolved even further into the nosocomium, which comes from the Greek words for disease and to take care of. According to the article, these early Byzantine institutions completely flipped the concept of a medical facility on its head. Rather than just being a place where sick people were sent away to die, these were the first true hospitals, offering institutional medical care and, crucially, the actual possibility of a cure. The speed of this rollout was just incredible. By 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea formally instructed bishops to build a hospice or hospital in every single city that had a cathedral. And just a few decades later, in 369 AD, St. Basil constructed the first advanced hospital complex in Cappadocia. The author notes this wasn't just some basic clinic either. It included a rehab unit, workshops, and industrial schools for occupational training. It was literally centuries ahead of its time. The article also links this exact impulse for social care directly to the foundation of global education. The author points out that the earliest universities, we're talking Bologna, Oxford, Paris, were originally founded specifically to ensure Christian ministers were highly educated. And here's a surprising fact. Citing Professor Rodney Stark, the author points out that even the foundational training centers for Islamic medical advances, like the great Nestorian medical centers in Syria and Persia, were rooted in Judeo-Christian and Greek institutions. The center in Junishapur, for example, was considered the greatest intellectual center of its entire era. Finally, Section 4, The Roots of Modern Science, Theological Foundations. Now, what's really interesting here is the boldest claim of the whole article regarding the theological foundations required for the scientific method to even exist, and it comes from a surprisingly secular source. Dr. Van Mols cites Robert Oppenheimer, yes, the famous theoretical physicist, who plainly stated that modern science was born out of the Christian worldview. The article argues that the core presuppositions required to do science aren't just naturally occurring in human history, they had to be culturally developed. Mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead actually builds on this exact point. He argued that belief in a rational creator was an absolutely necessary prerequisite for science. Because medieval Christians insisted on the rationality of God, they naturally assumed that the universe God created would also be rational, orderly, and therefore measurable and discoverable. The author pushes this even further by leaning on modern agnostic authorities to challenge the purely secular framing of scientific history. He quotes Marcelo Gleiser, a theoretical physicist, an agnostic, and a Templeton Prize winner. Gleiser claims that atheism is actually inconsistent with the scientific method. Why? Because atheism is a categorical declaration of non-belief, whereas science relies on hypotheses and evidence, not absolute unprovable declarations. The text uses this to argue that science inherently requires a leap of faith that the universe is orderly and comprehensible. So the crucial point the author is making here is that this Christian worldview didn't just theoretically support science. Practically speaking, it literally drove discovery. The article points to the devout Christians who founded major branches of experimental science: Francis Bacon driving the scientific revolution, Robert Boyle in chemistry, Edward Jenner founding immunology with the very first vaccine, Louis Pasteur in bacteriology, Gregor Mendel in genetics, and Copernicus and Kepler mapping out celestial mechanics. Like Dr. Van Mol notes with a bit of dry wit, our Christian forebears were clearly not sitting on their hands. Which brings us to the end of the explainer, and the very same provocative question the author leaves his readers with. After tracing this massive historical legacy, from preserving classical education and the birth of human rights, all the way to the founding of hospitals, universities, and the scientific method, the article asks, are we as a culture at risk of losing our Christian heritage? It's a compelling question, right? It forces us to look really closely at the historical roots of the institutions and values we rely on every day, and ponder what happens if those roots are forgotten. Thank you so much for joining me as we unpacked this source material. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.